Thank you. My dad is from New England. There you go. I was raised to be a Red Sox fan. It did not work. I understand that's the one with the small ball that's like this with the stitches in it. Yeah. So Father Gregory asked me to speak about conversion to the Orthodox Christian faith here in 2023. And I'm delighted because conversion is a topic very close to my heart. And when I got his invitation, I sat down and started writing something new. So you are the first to hear what I'm about to say. I should also say, because I'm so enthusiastic about it, this is not going to be super short. So settle in, get something to eat. As I said, conversion is a topic very close to my heart, and trying to understand our current cultural moment. Where are we in 2023? In these terms is something that I wrestle with pretty much every single day. I became an Orthodox Christian myself at Pascha of 1998, 25 years ago in central North Carolina. The world was a little different then. Bill Clinton was in his second term as the American president and busily denying having anything to do with a certain White House intern. He would be impeached later that year. A corporation was founded that year that was called Google. Alta Vista was the hot new search engine. Anyone remember Alta Vista? Yeah, there's my old school. Yeah. And Amazon was just 4 years out of Jeff Bezos' garage. Sonny Bono died that year in a skiing accident. And Cambodian dictator and mass murderer Pol Pot also breathed his last. And so did Frank Sinatra. The Evangelical Orthodox Church had been received by Metropolitan Philip of the Antiochian Archdiocese a little over 10 years before. And here's a mic stand. Thanks be to God. I knew you could do it. It's much easier because I like to gesture. Father Peter Gilchrist's book, Becoming Orthodox, A Journey to the Ancient Christian Faith, had been published just 9 years before, in 1989. And 4 years before, the first gathering of all Orthodox bishops in America happened at the Antiochian village in Ligonier, Pennsylvania. About 3.5 weeks before my chrismation, a certain Yale University professor and former Lutheran clergyman was also chrismated into the Orthodox Church at St. Vladimir's Seminary Chapel, church historian Yaroslav Pelikan. It was Annunciation that year for him. There was no Assembly of Bishops. There was no Ancient Faith Radio. We still had SCOBA. IOCC was just 6 years old. OCMC was a ripe 14, and OCF in its form at the time was 22. And it would be 2 years before the canonization of St. Raphael of Brooklyn. I mention all this not to give you a history lesson, but rather to give a sense of how different the world is from just 25 years ago until now, even if you look at the small strip of history that is Orthodox Christianity in America. When I became Orthodox, one did not bump into Orthodoxy haphazardly on social media. Social media was almost not even a thing, except for the now ancient and mostly forgotten text-only news groups called Usenet. Who remembers Usenet? A couple of Gen Xers out there, yeah. This is my tribe. At the time, almost no parishes had web pages. And the web pages that did exist of some of the Orthodox jurisdictions were delightfully quaint by modern standards, and even a little quaint by 1998 standards. Most of the Orthodox web pages at the time belonged to chapters of OCF, because most of the web pages at the time belonged to universities. I found the Orthodox Church because it got brought up in a conversation in the summer of 1997 at an Italian restaurant in Raleigh, North Carolina. I was talking with a Protestant friend who had decided to become Catholic. whom I had known from our time together as evangelical missionary kids on the island of Guam in the late 1980s. I don't remember who mentioned the church, him or me, but neither of us really knew anything about it. But it stuck in my head for some reason, and I went back to the university computer lab and typed in Orthodox Church into Alta Vista. And then there were a handful of things. I saw those OCF websites, and thank God for them. I also found something called the St. Pachomius Library, which is an online repository of patristic texts. Still exists. There was also the Orthodox Christian Information Center, which had been founded in 1996 and very strongly represented its particular take on things. There were also references to email groups one could join, including a couple designed for evangelicals to talk with Orthodox Christians, so I joined. Within a couple months, someone on one of the lists invited me to church, and then someone else did too. I visited a very small OCA mission that no longer exists, and I later visited an Antiochian parish in Raleigh, North Carolina named All Saints. I did not know anyone at either church, but I was smitten. And since the Antiochian parish was closer to my house, started going there. And within a week, asked the priest how to become an Orthodox Christian. I feel for that priest. By that point, I had become convinced that the Orthodox Church was the true church of Jesus Christ, founded by him through the apostles, that the evangelical Protestantism I had been raised in had been helpful, but ultimately wrong in a lot of ways, that my future belonged in the Orthodox Church. I created an Amazon account, and one of my first purchases was the Gilchrist book, a satisfying read for someone like me who came from a very similar background. It's also a very quick and easy read. As Father Peter John Gilchrist once told me years later, you don't need a dictionary to read my dad's books. It's true, if you ever read one of his books. Mine, on the other hand. So I was sold. I was also 22. And it might be a minor wonder that I'm still an Orthodox Christian, because I don't know how it all would have gone if I were 22 here in 2023. So it's 2023 that I want to talk about now. If we're going to discuss conversion, then the place that we have to begin is evangelism, because it is evangelism that leads the way to conversion. When someone hears the gospel, he can then become obedient to the gospel. Back in the late 80s and then through the 90s, the evangelistic pitches of Orthodox Christians in America basically took three different approaches. There were variations, of course, and there were more than these three, but all three are still with us today and are still being used. And I'll describe each of them to you, and then I'm going to explain why I think these aren't appropriate here in 2023. And this critique will, I hope, help us to refocus our evangelistic work. Perhaps the most frequent evangelistic message was this, probably still is: the Orthodox Church is the one true church, and so you had better join it. In the 90s, convert Frank Schaeffer often summarized this message with two questions, which for him were intended to be so compelling that you had to become Orthodox. Number one, can you locate the church? Number two, does it have authority? So the idea is that if you look long and hard enough, if you do enough historical research, then you will discover that the Orthodox Church is the New Testament church, and that neither Rome nor any Protestant church can make that claim. Second, once you have identified the Orthodox Church as the one true church, then you have to submit to it because, of course, this is straight from God. This, in fact, was the primary evangelistic mode that convinced me. I felt that I had no choice once I became convinced that there was this unbroken historical chain that stretched from AD 33 to 1997. I had to become Orthodox. This approach is why you see Orthodox Christianity called the ancient Christian faith. And indeed, it is why my employer is named Ancient Faith Ministries. It is an apologetical tool designed to point out that the rest of the Christian churches, while well-meaning, are Johnny-come-latelys. You see the same tack being taken with another Orthodox evangelistic outreach program, which is titled, Get to Know the Original. Until not too long ago, I think June of last year, there was even a very well-intentioned website with that title, getknowtheoriginal.net. If you go there now, there's nothing. It featured what are likely some very familiar mottos. We're not Jewish, but we are Orthodox. We're not Roman, but we are Catholic. We're not Protestant, but the Bible came from us. We're not denominational, we're pre-denominational. I've seen this on a number of parish websites too, and forgive me if it's on yours. Just making some suggestions. So all the rest of the churches are, well, they're not the original. Maybe they aren't cheap imitations exactly, though maybe. But they're still not the original, the authentic, the real deal. That's the one you want. So there's some problems with this approach. And I think they're magnifying all the time. I'll say, by the way, that I still agree with what I just described. I believe and I teach that the Orthodox Church is indeed uniquely the Church of Jesus Christ. I'm on published record saying that over and over again. But what I'm talking about now is an evangelistic message. Not everything that is true is also an effective or appropriate evangelistic message. Here are the problems. First, there are a lot of groups out there making similar claims, with the Roman Catholic Church probably being the most obvious. There are, in fact, piles of people who have looked at all the same evidence and concluded that actually it's Rome who's kept the faith of the apostles and the Orthodox have taken the left turn. One of my friends from seminary just decided that recently. He left the Orthodox Church. Now he belongs to the Catholic Church. He went to seminary with me. Do your research. That's the motto here. But funnily enough, it still doesn't convince hardly anyone of anything, especially not in 2023. Everyone screams that at each other. Do your research. Now you can spend weeks and even years researching something. And if your biases and sources lead you in a particular direction, you can come to a radically different conclusion from other people who will look at all the same stuff. A second problem is that this whole apologetic is aimed at Christians. In 1998, the religiously unaffiliated in America were just 13%, but now, here in 2023, they are 29%. It's more than doubled. Why would someone care who is the one true church when they don't even care about the church at all? That's like trying to tell me that the greatest football team is the Steelers or the Eagles. I might agree with you, but I don't care. Sorry, football fans. Who cares about the true church when he doesn't care about being Christian? Perhaps the biggest problem with this approach is that it is about the superiority, capital S, of the Orthodox Church. One true is inherently a comparative phrase. It means that the rest are in some sense false, so we're better. But our betterness is couched in relative terms. We're not this, we're the original. Yet somehow we keep defining ourselves by other groups. Again, I do believe that the Orthodox Church is uniquely the church, no question. I believe that. But if you hang your evangelism on a statement that we're better, then as soon as someone becomes unconvinced of that or finds something else even better, then he's likely to go somewhere else. And here in 2023 especially, where every narrative is contested and contestable, leading off with, we're the best, is kind of a joke now. Saying we're the best just sounds petty. Everyone says that. Another approach to Orthodox evangelism that has been around here in the U.S. for a long time is what I call, we don't believe in that angry God. The way it goes is like this. Western Christianity believes in a God who is, from the moment you are conceived, planning to smite you unless you do what he wants. What he wants might be racking up indulgences and merits among the Catholics, or it might be saying the sinner's prayer among the Baptists. Either way, he's mad, so you better make him unmad. This one does have a theological basis to it, which is that both Roman Catholics and Protestants have a teaching traditionally called satisfaction, in which God must be satisfied for your sins. But it turns out that most Catholics and Protestants do not envision God as being angry all the time and ready to smite you. You can, of course, find ones who teach that way, but it is a caricature to depict them all that way. And since most don't see God that way, you would first have to convince them that they do, before you can then pitch the not angry God of the Orthodox Church to them. But the bigger problem with this approach is that often smuggled in with the image of the not angry God is the God who does not exercise judgment. Divine judgment is a big can of theological worms. But for our purposes, I will say that the Orthodox Church absolutely believes in the judgment of God. God is just and will bring vindication to the oppressed, which includes bringing down the oppressor from his mighty place. God's wrath is a real thing in Orthodox tradition because it's in the Bible, which is this book. You might have heard of it. Not to mention being in the Fathers, the church services, and so forth. And of course, his wrath is not like human wrath. Rather, it is the establishment of his justice. So it's true that we don't believe that God is raging angry at everyone, but very few other Christians really believe that anyway. And if we push it too far, then we end up with a God who has no justice, a God who is not going to make an end to sin and vindicate his people. But like leading off with, we're the one true church, this is an evangelistic pitch, here it is again, aimed at people who are already Christians. It is fundamentally a reaction. And it's a reaction to what we think they teach in their churches. Now, if you can't get them with we're the one true church or we don't believe in that angry God, then perhaps you can get them with another evangelistic tactic, which I like to call, look at all our stuff. Nervous chuckles. We point to our beautiful churches, our beautiful music, our beautiful incense, beautiful rituals, beautiful vestments, and we may even say, come and see. That line is in St. John's Gospel, so it feels appropriate. And hey, look at those photos online. Listen to those satisfying gasps when we do the church tours at our food festival and people look up for the first time. It's pretty great. Cue the quote from the Russian Primary Chronicle, where the emissaries of Prince Vladimir visit Hagia Sophia in Constantinople and they say, we cannot forget that beauty. Let's face it, aesthetically, Orthodox Christianity really does knock your socks off. There isn't any other Christian tradition that comes close to the level of aesthetic saturation and engagement as the Orthodox Church. It can be really compelling. In fact, sometimes when I go scrolling through the ex-Orthodox subreddit on Reddit, which I don't recommend, by the way. Sometimes when I go through this group, these angry ex-Orthodox people, I see people who now hate the Orthodox Church, but really miss the music, the architecture, and so on. But as you can guess, there are some problems with look at all our stuff. Again, though, I am in no way knocking the things that I mentioned. I can't live without them myself. I'm talking about an evangelistic message. First, if you convert people with an aesthetic experience, when they get used to that experience, they will eventually come down from the high. They will eventually no longer notice every glorious, entrancing detail. They may even become bored. It's hard to believe, but it's totally a thing. No Orthodox person would ever say, I'm bored in church. If they stop having that aesthetic engagement, then they will indeed begin to forget that beauty. And let's not forget when the choir is kind of off. I know that never happens here, of course. Or maybe the church building isn't really to the level of all those photos we stare at of Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, or Christ the Savior in Moscow, or St. Sava in Belgrade. Or maybe the incense made them cough. Or maybe the priest's vestments were wrinkly, or his voice was out of tune. All these things can bring that aesthetic experience back down to the earthly. Most of all, though, let's think about that line, "Come and see." Sometimes it's used as a way not to have to talk about the Orthodox faith. Sorry, I don't do theology, but come and have a look at our cool stuff. Come and see. But the bigger problem is that we've taken a line from the Gospels and we ripped it out of its context. We hear it in St. John's Gospel with the reading on the first Sunday of Lent. So we just heard it. When St. Philip said it to St. Nathaniel, "Come and see." But he was not inviting Nathaniel to an aesthetic experience at all. He was inviting him to come and meet Jesus Christ. And when he met him, he called him Son of God and King of Israel. Before we get to how I think we ought to be doing evangelism, let's talk now about our present moment. It's a weird one. In September of 2021, it's about a year and a half ago, I published a brief article titled, "The Sudden Influx into the Orthodox Church." We were about a year and a half into the pandemic, and I noticed that our medium-sized parish in Emmaus, Pennsylvania had more than 20 catechumens all at once. Our parish was founded in the late 80s, and I was its pastor for 11 years, familiar with all the records, so I knew we had more at that moment than we'd ever had. In fact, I told the current pastor, this is more than in all 11 years that I was pastor combined. I began to hear about the same thing happening in other parishes, so I put a poll in a Facebook Orthodox clergy group asking if clergy were seeing a similar phenomenon in their own parishes. 90% said yes. And that's when I published my little article. In the year and a half that has followed from then, the pattern seems to be holding. I've heard a lot more anecdotal evidence for this all across the Anglophone world, including outside North America. There is this influx of inquirers, catechumens, and converts. I've heard it's also happening in non-English speaking contexts as well. Have you seen it here? Yeah. Like I said, almost no one says no to that question now. And as I've talked about it, I've heard all kinds of theories about what's driving it. We can't point to some organized nationwide or even worldwide Orthodox evangelistic campaign because there hasn't been one. Especially not one that would touch so many people in so many places all at once. So we're left to theorize. Many people will point to a favorite teacher or commentator on the internet who started just a few years ago. Others will point to particular political conditions. Others will mention specific demographics, especially young single men. But as I've spoken with converts themselves, asking about what brought them there, I've noticed no pattern for who they are and how they got there. In some places it's true that many converts are young single men, but that pattern isn't true everywhere. In Emmaus, for instance, most of our recent converts have been couples, some young with children, some middle-aged, some senior citizens. Now, I will say something about young men in a few minutes, though, because it is a thing. Aside from the demographic variety, what do these converts point to as the impetus for their arrival at our doors? Are they all listening to one engaging speaker or reading some new book? They're not. Everyone seems to have a different vector. Certainly most of them are not being brought by their in-person friends who are already members of our churches. That is to our shame. Showing up on their own. Most are hearing about the Orthodox Church online in some way or other, but it's not one way. And what's amazing is that while the presence of Orthodox Christians on the internet is the most confusing, the most contentious, the most irritating, and performative that it has ever been, filled with uninformed opinions, personality cults, untreated mental illness, outright heresy, uncanonical sects with big megaphones, rogue clergy, culture warring, political distortion of theology, and ill-tempered pseudo-apologetics led by neophytes. people are still actually showing up at our doors. It's a miracle. It is. These converts must have something in common, though, or else they wouldn't have shown up all at once. What could it be? It's hard when you're in a cultural moment to define it. That doesn't stop the chattering class from trying to anyway. That includes me. So, at least for now. So here's my theory. This is my theory. For a long time now, public culture has become more explicitly disenchanted. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean that we place our sense of authority and our attention in daily life on the materially empirical. Our eyes do not generally look up to the heavens for our hopes or help. We no longer have a sense that we're surrounded by angels and demons all the time, whose activity influences us, permeates us, and pulls us in one direction or another. The wheels that drive disenchantment could be said to begin at multiple places in history. My preferred marker is the rise of individualism in the wake of the Protestant Reformation. With the inward look of man, not to his soul and the God who makes his home there, but rather to personal authenticity and making oneself the measure of all things, there is an inattention to the binding together action which comes from awareness of and interaction with the unseen world. Thus saith the Lord is no longer a powerful word that heralds divine energy going out into the world to bring about the will of God. It instead becomes reduced to divine command, with an implied threat aimed at disobedience. God's words are not for the community, but rather for me, or not for me, if I so choose. Here in 2023, it is no longer a thus saith the Lord world at all. Instead, studies show has become the phrase that authenticates what is true. And medical doctors and scientists are hailed as almost gods. They are where the buck really, truly stops. One might believe in God or have a religious life, but when you really need help, you don't call your priest. You call a doctor. Or you might call a lawyer. Any lawyers in the room? I see some nodding. Okay. I'm not going to make any lawyer jokes, I promise. Well, my favorite lawyer jokes are usually told by lawyers, so I'm convinced you guys all tell them to each other. You might call a lawyer. Disenchanted life also means that the higher transcendent aspirations that draw one's attention upward to heaven cannot govern daily life in the real world. Because there's no higher power to whom we can not just turn but appeal when it comes to our interactions with one another, our attention is drawn to the earth instead, to a lower power. And that power is the law. A disenchanted society is a legalistic society. Legalism has a degrading effect on the human spirit and on the spirit of a nation. To get a sense of the disenchantment of legalism, I'm going to quote, and forgive me, this is a little bit of a long quote, but it's so good. I'm going to quote from the great Russian Orthodox thinker and dissident under communism, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who said this: Western society has chosen for itself the organization best suited to its purposes, and one I might call legalistic. The limits of human rights and rightness are determined by a system of laws. Such limits are very broad. People in the West have acquired considerable skill in using, interpreting, and manipulating law, though laws tend to be too complicated for an average person to understand without the help of an expert. Every conflict is solved according to the letter of the law, and this is considered to be the ultimate solution. If one is right from a legal point of view, nothing more is required. Nobody may mention that one could still not be entirely right, and urge self-restraint or renunciation of these rights, call for sacrifice and selfless risk. This would simply sound absurd. Voluntary self-restraint is almost unheard of. Everybody strives toward further expansion to the extreme limit of legal frames. An oil company is legally blameless when it buys up an invention of a new type of energy in order to prevent its use. A food product manufacturer is legally blameless when he poisons his produce to make it last longer. After all, people are free not to purchase it. He goes on to say, I've spent all my life under a communist regime, and I will tell you that a society without any objective legal scale is a terrible one indeed. But a society with no other scale but the legal one is also less than worthy of man. A society based on the letter of the law and never reaching any higher fails to take advantage of the full range of human possibilities. The letter of the law is too cold and formal to have a beneficial influence on society. Whenever the tissue of life is woven of legalistic relationships, this creates an atmosphere of spiritual mediocrity that paralyzes man's noblest impulses. And it will simply be impossible to bear up to the trials of this threatening century with nothing but the supports of a legalistic structure. End quote. Solzhenitsyn uttered these words in his commencement speech at Harvard University in 1978. And it was titled A World Split Apart. 45 years later, we are seeing exactly what he meant. He was not a prophet, however. The disenchantment was already well underway in the late 70s. I'll give you one more quote from this same speech, which might seem even more prescient, and this was short. Destructive and irresponsible freedom has been granted boundless space. Society has turned out to have scarce defense against the abyss of human decadence. For example, against the misuse of liberty for moral violence against young people, such as motion pictures full of pornography, crime, and horror. This is all considered to be part of freedom and to be counterbalanced in theory by the young people's right not to look and not to accept. Life organized legalistically has thus shown its inability to defend itself against the corrosion of evil. End quote. Now, I was not quite 3 years old when Solzhenitsyn somehow described 2023 in 1978. We could add to his words what he might not have predicted, but would certainly have seen as a logical outcome of these patterns: the rise of social media addiction, and through smartphones, 24-hour access to those horrors he referred to as moral violence against young people. Did you know that the average age that a young person in this country first views pornography is now 11 years old? And it's because we all have these. So, now you're all depressed. It's good. I'm a big believer in taking you down into the depths before I start to pull you out again. So Solzhenitsyn saw all this in 1978. And if the 1980s, apart from some particular movements such as the Evangelical Orthodox Church, were not a time of almost sudden nationwide influx into the Orthodox Church, what happened in the past couple years that is bringing that influx? What happened? I think it was the pandemic. Here's why. For years, factors have been in place driving human beings apart from each other, especially in the Western world. Societal mobility pulls families and friends apart as people find it easier to relocate for education and jobs. Internet communication, especially with deliberately designed addictive social media, they made it that way, has made it easier not to see other people. The media Solzhenitsyn pointed to in 1978 is now instantly accessible for almost everyone all the time. You don't even have to show up together as a family to watch something on TV. Everyone can watch the show or movie on his device in his own time and at his own convenience. I think about this every time I announce a speaking engagement online. And this one was no exception, by the way. And several people will always ask, will it be recorded? It is expected that one should not have to show up. It should be repackaged and redistributed, accessed whenever you want, and you can do it all alone. Believe me, as a professional podcaster and writer, I think about this all the time. Like this is what I make. We did not know what the pandemic would really do, especially when we were in that first weird magical moment of 2 weeks to stop the spread. Seems so long ago now. It stretched into 2 years or more. But there's at least one reason now that we call the latest generation Zoomers, and that is because they are coming of age in the age of Zoom. The Zoom meeting has fundamentally altered our world. You don't have to be together to have a meeting. That's huge. It's a big change. It's not that we didn't have this technology in 2019. Oh, we were so innocent in 2019. But we didn't have the demand for it. And now we cannot live without it. I'm not knocking this technology. Saint Philaret of Moscow in 1851 commented on a transformative technology of his own time. A friend of mine sent me this quote. I thought it was great. If the railroad, an invention of human impatience, serves beneficially as a road to God and his saints, may its producers be blessed. And we know it served as a road to St. Raphael of Brooklyn, to St. Tikhon when he was here, and other saints. It did. We can also redeem the internet and use it for the gospel. But we also cannot deny that something happened. And Zoom was really just a symptom of what happened, a way to cope with it. What happened is that everyone was told to stay home. And we mostly did. And in staying home, we lost what I've come to call the last enchantment, which is the enchantment of simply being with other people. There's something about being with other people that participates in the unseen world, and it binds us together. It's hard to define, but we all know it. Even now, as you're gathered here in this place, listening to my voice, but especially in the divine service that we just celebrated together, you can sense it. We can also sense it when we eat together. And the Greeks have a word for this sense, which is pareia. Any Greeks here? You know what pareia is? Yeah, right? In various ways, by being together, by engaging in actions together, especially ritual actions, we are in communion. And so when the pandemic came, we lost this last enchantment. There were people who were on the edge of something. Some series of events in life, some realization, some experience, some hope, some despair, some relationship, some disappointment, whatever it might be. People on the edge of something. And these people walked over the edge and became aware in some way of the Orthodox Christian Church. Many of the new converts I have spoken to have said to me, well, it was time. What time means for them is 1,000 definitions. But they knew the time had arrived. And of course, we can see that God brought them there. And many have no religious background. But many who do also notice their former churches moved fully online, and Zoom church or YouTube church became a thing, with some churches even declaring that they now have an online campus. There were Orthodox churches that streamed services, of course, but for the Orthodox, moving fully online, even declaring an online campus, just cannot be a thing. Why? Because to do this thing called Orthodox Christianity, you have to show up. You have to show up. Some people these days claim to be Orthodox without showing up. I'm not kidding about this. You can find people on Twitter or elsewhere who call themselves Orthodox, or even they call themselves catechumens, who have never met an Orthodox priest or walked through the doors of an Orthodox church. It's a little mind-blowing. They are not doing Orthodox Christianity because they've not shown up. Having the right opinions and following the right social media swarms does not make you an Orthodox Christian. Of course, a huge number of those engaging in these behaviors are young men. I promised I would talk about that. But many of them are also actually showing up. So why are young men an emphasis in some places? I'm not certain, but here's my theory. All young people are looking to figure out their narrative in life, where they belong, how they belong, who they are within the contexts of their life. And I think that the particular dysfunctions that we see now, while spiritually deadly to both men and women, are somewhat heightened when it comes to attacking young men. Now, what do I mean? If you look at the first few chapters of Genesis, you can see that God gives two tasks to humanity. Fill the earth and cultivate it, or subdue it, if you're reading the King James. These two tasks are a continuation of the creative work of God himself, which gave a formless earth shape and then filled its void with life. Eve's emphasis is on filling the earth with life. This is not only through childbirth, but through all the ways that life can be created and nurtured. She needs Adam for this task, of course. Adam's task is cultivation, giving structure to what is unstructured. He needs Eve for this task, but this is his primary responsibility. Our time does attack filling the world with life, for sure. Consider not just abortion, but the whole sterility cult that is the many kinds of sexual immorality. Notice how they all result in preventing or destroying fertility. But the times are not yet fully against filling the world with life in every respect. We do have to have some children, and we want to see the world filled with other kinds of life and beauty. But our moment is where the former legalisms are falling apart at a very high rate. Legalism being a kind of toxic approach to creating structure. And it is not just legalisms, but also moral consensus. All kinds of cultural institutions are collapsing, not just churches, but also in education, government. People's participation, even in social clubs like the Rotary, is being sheared away. Everything is losing members. So much of what was constructed is being deconstructed. I know that some point to a societal attack on masculinity, that all masculinity now is considered toxic masculinity. To me, that is really just one aspect of the destruction of the cultivating, structuring responsibility given to men in Genesis. Anyway, I'm not saying that men have it worse than women in 2023. I'm not saying that. But my theory, at least, is that this particular kind of collapse hits men earlier than women, at least for now. Men like structure, and when they see structures collapsing all around them, that drives uncertainty. Many will do crazy things in response. And we're seeing that left and right. But some will try to be more sane in response. Some see the sanity of the tradition of the Orthodox Church, which of course is very structured, with a deep, long cultivated culture. I'm not going to hang my hat on this, but that is why I think we are seeing a plurality of young men in the recent influx of converts. That's my theory. Now, I'm not going to dwell on young men in particular, because that's not my emphasis here. But I also think it's worth pondering why a subset of these young male converts become angry soon after they arrive in the church, quickly turning on not just their fellow Orthodox Christians, but bishops and other clergy. They discover that real life in the church isn't according to the structure that they had imagined. They thought they were escaping uncertainty, but then they find that church leaders are fallible, and the church isn't monolithic, not only in the personal views and behaviors of members, but even within an acceptable range of theological expression and pastoral application. A friend of mine describes this as converting to Orthodoxy because it checks off all the boxes. Checks off all the boxes. If you check the boxes off right, you're Orthodox. Why is this so important? It is important because of a basic principle of evangelism. Whatever you convert them with is what you convert them to. Whatever you convert them with is what you convert them to. Whatever someone's age, demographic background, etc., if that person converts to the Orthodox Church because they think they are joining the very best religion, or because they think they have found a church that aligns with their politics, whatever they are, or because it's so not my previous church, or because the church has the particular aesthetics or liturgics they desire, then that is where their heart actually is. That's what they came for, and it's what they expect to be there. But that is not what the church is for. None of it is. People who convert can be introduced to the Orthodox Church in all sorts of ways. The most common one, I think, and mostly kind of unsung as well, has to be marriage. Someone's like, tell me about when someone one time said to me, tell me about the average, American convert to the Orthodox Church. And I say, it's a guy who married a Greek girl. We don't talk about those guys that much, I don't know why. But however people got here, authentic conversion is not to any of those things that I just named. Authentic conversion is to Jesus Christ. We tend to think of converting to Orthodoxy as joining the church. And that is not wrong, but it's also not really right. Becoming an Orthodox Christian is about life in Jesus Christ. It is about being baptized into the God-man, being given the gift of the Holy Spirit through chrismation, and then living in faithfulness with those great gifts, doing the works of God in this world. Ask any faithful Orthodox pastor, and he will tell you that that's what he really wants his parishioners to be doing. The door through which someone walks in order to get to that conversion is to hear the gospel and to become obedient to it. From looking at the scriptures then, and from looking at all the tradition of the church, I have this question. Why? 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 Why do we keep trying to convert people with messages that are not the gospel? If I had to answer that question cynically, I might say it's laziness. People are showing up, so who cares why they got here and what they want out of it? Please fill in a pledge form. I think in some cases that's probably true, laziness. That's why we preach the stuff that we do. But what seems more likely, or at least more prevalent, is this. While every last thread of the Orthodox tradition is dyed deeply with the radiant colors of the gospel, its message in our time often has not risen to the level of our conscious embrace. Generally speaking, what is preached, what is taught, and especially what is presented to the world and picked up by converts are things that are good, that are outgrowths of the gospel, that are built upon the gospel, but actually aren't the gospel. I believe that this at least partly explains not only why, despite the recent influx of converts, we also have an outflow of converts, and of course, famously, of people raised in the church as well. So even though we have lots of people joining right now, I would be willing to bet you that we are net still losing people. So here now is the very core of my message for you this evening. What does it actually mean to convert to Jesus Christ? The gospel itself, the evangelion in ancient Greek, is a declaration of a victory. That is what evangelion meant in the ancient world, and it was used in this way long before Jesus was even born. It was not invented for the New Testament. It is a pre-Christian genre. That declaration of victory generally consisted of three things being announced by a herald who would ride into your town. He would announce three things. Number one, who the conqueror was. This would include his list of titles and perhaps his glorious origins. Number two, what he had accomplished. Usually a list of victories and other accomplishments, often the fact that he just won a battle against whoever was ruling your city in the fields nearby. And number three, he also announced what the conqueror now expected of everyone. This was sometimes a list of new laws, and it was usually because the newly conquered people now had a new ruler. The gospel of Jesus Christ, then, is to announce who is the conqueror. Jesus Christ is the God-man, the Son of God, and the Son of Man, one person and two natures. He's the Son of the Father and also the Son of the Virgin Mary, fully God, fully man. Number two, what has he accomplished? He's defeated his enemies, the demons, who introduced sin to mankind and enslaved us. He's destroyed their power, loosing us from the slavery of sin and defeating even the last enemy, which is death. Number three, what does he expect? He now expects us loyally to obey his commandments, to be faithful to him in worship, in struggling against sin, and in doing his good works in the world. That's the gospel of Jesus Christ. And if what we present, not only to potential converts, but even to our own children, as the primary reason to enter, belong to, and remain in the church, is something other than that, then we are literally, and I'm sorry to say this, we are literally preaching what St. Paul calls another gospel. Now, nothing of what I just said should be a surprise to any Orthodox Christian. You've heard it over and over in the divine services, in the fathers, and so on. It is everywhere in the Orthodox tradition, but it's often not what is put up front and preached as the gospel by everyone who belongs to the church. Since that is the actual content of the gospel, then I have some suggestions for preaching that content here in 2023, which it turns out take advantage of the disenchantment of our present moment. First, we don't need to be coy with the gospel, being afraid that people will find it offensive to preach who Jesus is, what he accomplished, and what he expects. Our world is filled enough with outlandish claims, and boy is it filled with some outlandish claims, that I don't think we need to worry now that the gospel isn't polite. It's an announcement of a victory, not a pleading offer to make your life better. But also, perhaps more importantly, the gospel announcement takes place within a particular cosmology, a spiritual world populated with not just God and man, but also with angels, demons, saints, heroes, and monsters. This might sound like fantasy fiction, but actually it's just the Bible. There are dragons in the Bible. It's an inescapable fact. Instead of being embarrassed by them or trying to explain them away, it makes far more sense as a Christian with integrity to grapple with them, to try to understand them, to include them in our preaching of the gospel. If you've never tried it, you can never imagine the amount of attention you suddenly get when you say to someone, you know there's dragons in the Bible? Or my favorite one, and I will not explain this, there are giants in the New Testament? Anyway, because there are. Further, the Orthodox tradition's crowded spiritual world, to which we as human beings are always permeable, is indeed what people actually experience. Modern people often speak of hearing voices inside them telling them one thing or another. And we feel pursued by demons all the time. We also know that they are on the move on a grand scale as we see the proliferation of death, disease, and war. The Orthodox tradition gives a coherent account for the evil we see in the world. Even further, the Orthodox tradition gives a coherent hope for the defeat of evil in the world. We sing that Christ has trampled down death by death. In Greek, that's thanato, thanaton patisas. Ancient people would have heard that word thanatos and recognized the name of the death god. So the defeat of death by Christ is not so much a metaphysical victory over an effect that everyone suffers, but rather the throwing down of a violent, dark demon who once held power over us. That is why the scriptures describe the devil as the one who has the power of death. That's Hebrews 2:14. The scriptures also say that Christ came. Why did Jesus come? Funnily enough, it's actually explicit there. 1 John 3:8. The Son of God appeared, as it says, to destroy the works of the devil. Not to make your life better. To destroy the works of the devil. This news that Jesus Christ is victorious over the demonic hosts who assail us with temptations and the suffering that everyone experiences, this is truly good news in this present world. It cuts through the contentious narratives that are everywhere, which are demon-inspired and demon-directed. And it gets us straight to the one who is truth himself as he smashes in the gates of Hades, commands his angels to bind up the old deceiving dragon, and casts him into the abyss forever. Come to Pascha, everybody. At the beginning of the baptismal service, after the priest prays the exorcisms over the person to be baptized, he asks this question. Now, there's a few different translations of this. He asks him this question: have you renounced Satan? And the reply is, I have renounced him. In the Greek, this is called the apotaxis. And so the reply in Greek is apotasome. I have renounced him. Apotasome. The priest then asks, have you aligned yourself with Christ? And the reply is, I have aligned myself. This is called the syndaxis. And the reply in Greek is syndasome. I've aligned myself. Now the base word here, taxis, means order or alignment. It is used in the military context to refer to enlistment. So when the baptismal candidate says apotasome, he's saying, I'm deserting the army of Satan. And when he says syndasome, he's saying, I'm enlisting with Christ. He switched his allegiance, enabled by exorcism, with the demonic influence driven out by Christ. As we consider attracting converts through proper evangelism, through preaching the gospel, we also must consider how they are welcomed, how they are trained for entrance into the church, and how they are trained following that entrance. It is not enough that they be convinced that being an Orthodox Christian is what they ought to do. What you are convinced of, you may become unconvinced of. Rather, they must be truly evangelized so that they have an encounter with Jesus Christ himself, their eyes open so that they might recognize him. So that come and see really does mean come and see Jesus Christ, the hoped-for Messiah, which is what St. Philip was talking about to St. Nathaniel. What this means is that catechism, while it might include the standard sort of Orthodoxy 101 stuff, ought to have its main emphasis on making sure the gospel is preached to the potential convert. He or she might have shown up for some other reason. It's okay. I'm not going to turn anybody away. But it needs to be made clear what conversion actually is for and to whom conversion is made. But second, catechism ought to be aimed at training someone to be an actual Christian, showing him how to follow the commandments of Christ, showing how to participate in the services, showing how to give alms, showing how to pray at home alone and with family, showing how to practice silence, showing how to go on pilgrimage, showing how to fast in a consistent manner. Formation as a faithful Christian is far, far more important than the information that might go into encyclopedia entry about the Orthodox Church. We will all be judged in the end according to what we have done. This faithfulness, this loyalty is what it means to be aligned with Christ. Practically speaking, someone can read almost every bit of information there is to know about the church on the internet or in books. What they cannot get there is the actual training of being an Orthodox Christian. That comes only in the in-person, three-dimensional life of the parish community. It does not and cannot exist virtually. My final word then is this: conversion is to Christ. Conversion to Christ is what we preach. Conversion to Christ is what we expect to people who show up to our churches, whatever their background, whatever brought them to us. And conversion, perhaps for some of us, reconversion to Christ is what is necessary for us who are members of the church if any of this is going to communicate Christ to this dark, desperately lost world that is looking for him everywhere. Thank you very much.